Today's video sponsor is MSI and their B550 Tomahawk motherboard, a board which we've tested and found to deliver excellent VRM thermal performance. And when paired with the award-winning AMD Ryzen 5 3600 6-core 12-thread processor, makes for a great balanced option for gaming, content creation, and productivity. With lightning-fast PCIe Gen 4, 2.5 gigabits per second networking, and premium build and design quality, you can enjoy flagship-level features and performance at a price point that won't break the bank. Upgrade today and enjoy more cores and more performance via the links in the video description.
Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're continuing our investigations into NVIDIA's new GeForce RTX 3080 with a deep dive into ray tracing and DLSS performance. Steve has already done a pretty comprehensive look into how the card performs in general and gave you guys a bit of a teaser for what to expect with RTX performance, but now we're going to show you just how fast the RTX 3080 is in these special effects in a wider range of games. We're going to be placing a particular focus on comparing the RTX 3080 to the RTX 2080 Ti today, the previous fastest GPU for ray tracing, but you'll also see results for the RTX 2080 and 2070. There will also be quite a bit of discussion on RTX on versus RTX off performance, which really is the main talking point when it comes to ray tracing in particular. First, let's go through some of NVIDIA's claims about the RTX 3080's RTX capabilities and some of the changes they've made to the Ampere architecture versus Turing. The two big ones come in the form of updated next-generation ray tracing and updated next-generation tensor cores. On the RT side, NVIDIA says that Ampere is using a second-generation RT core, which packs three main improvements. The first is double the ray triangle intersection throughput. This isn't the only thing that an RT core can do and is only part of the ray tracing picture, but it is the part that's received a speed up. So not everything is faster in this RT core versus Turing, but we do get a big improvement to ray triangle intersection. Ampere also supports improved concurrent processing and introduces support for hardware accelerated ray traced motion blur. Ampere also brings us up to a third generation tensor core design, with Turing being the second gen and Volta the first gen. While the Ampere SM features half the tensor cores per SM, each tensor core is faster, so the overall SM delivers the same performance at minimum, or 2x the performance in some workloads compared to Turing, depending on the data type. There's also support for new data types with Ampere. While these are sort of the low-level changes NVIDIA has made to Ampere, there are of course question marks as to how these improvements will translate into real-world game performance. In NVIDIA's launch presentation, they spent a lot of time comparing the RTX 3080 to the RTX 2080 or RTX 2080 Super in ray-traced workloads, showing a 1.5 to 1.8x-ish improvement between those two parts. But these gains aren't just coming from the second-gen RT core and third-gen tensor core design. The RTX 3080 also simply features more RT cores, so we'll unpack today whether these ray tracing improvements are down to a brute force approach of adding more RT cores, or whether the RT cores themselves are faster. All the data for today's video was captured by Steve using his GPU test rig with the AMD Ryzen 9 3950X and 32GB of low latency DDR4 3200 memory in a dual rank configuration. This is one of the first times where I'm producing a video based off benchmarking that Steve has done, so this will be a bit interesting, but we'll see how it goes. Let's get into the blue bar graphs. I'm going to start with the oldest ray tracing game in our lineup today, Metro Exodus. This is an interesting one in that while the game does have DLSS, it's not using DLSS 2.0, so the image quality you gain with DLSS enabled is very lackluster, to put it lightly. So really what we're interested in here is whether the RTX 3080 is a capable card for native resolution ray tracing, because I can't imagine too many people will want to play with DLSS enabled here. So there's some good stuff and bad stuff to see here. The good stuff is that the RTX 3080 is faster than the RTX 2080 Ti for ray tracing in this title at 4K. We're seeing a 30% performance improvement, which makes the game somewhat playable at 4K using the Ultra preset with ray tracing. Cards like the RTX 2080 and especially the 2070 look very slow in comparison. Certainly those GPUs are nowhere near fast enough for 4K gaming in Metro with everything turned on. However, there is still an enormous performance difference between ray tracing enabled and disabled. With the RTX 3080, there is a 61% performance drop with ray tracing enabled versus disabled, which is equivalent to the performance drop seen when you turn on ray tracing with the RTX 2080 Ti. This suggests that while the 3080 is faster for ray tracing overall, that's down to simply being a faster card overall. The RT cores aren't any better at accelerating ray tracing in this game, as the performance delta between on and off is the same between Ampere and Turing. At 1440p, we start to run into some of the limitations of the Ryzen 9 3950X test system, but the takeaway here is largely the same. There's still a large performance difference between RT on and off, however the RTX 3080 is faster overall. While the 2080 Ti was more of a 60 FPS card at 1440p with ray tracing, the 3080 starts to push up into higher refresh rates, which is a welcome improvement. It also demolishes the RTX 2080 at 1440p with a 92% improvement to performance with ray tracing enabled. Shadow of the Tomb Raider includes ray trace shadows, but sticks to an older implementation of DLSS, so those results are only shown here for interest's sake. DLSS 1.0 kinda sucks, so it's not worth using in this game. At native 4K using the highest quality settings, the RTX 3080 gets closer to being a 4K 60 FPS card with ray tracing enabled, but doesn't quite get there. Still, a 34% performance improvement on the 2080 Ti is decent, slightly higher than the 30% gain we get in this title without ray tracing enabled. And there's no doubt the 3080 is much faster than the 2080. We're seeing 76% higher performance, and this really is key as the 2080 was not powerful enough for ray tracing at 4K. However, there's still a large gap between RT on and off. The RTX 3080 sees a 41% drop to frame rate with ray tracing enabled, compared to 43% with the RTX 2080 Ti, so the 3080 is about 5% faster at accelerating ray tracing in this game. That's not a significant improvement, so you'll still have to choose between high frame rates or ray tracing in these sorts of games. At 1440p, it's much the same. The 3080 is 35% faster than the 2080 Ti with ray tracing enabled, compared to 28% faster with ray tracing disabled. Both cards still see around a 40% drop to performance when you enable ray tracing, with the drop a bit lower on the 3080 but still significant. At this resolution, it's a choice between maxing out a 144Hz monitor with the 3080 or playing with decent but lower frame rates with ray tracing. Control is where things start to get much more interesting, because now we can talk about DLSS as well, because the game includes DLSS 2.0. So let's start with the 4K results and work our way through what's happening here. Just looking at native 4K gaming with and without ray tracing to start, the RTX 3080 is 44% faster than the RTX 2080 Ti in this game, using the maximum in-game quality settings, which includes both ray traced reflections and ambient occlusion. So this is a larger margin than the previous two games, and with a 125% lead on the RTX 2080, the 3080 is a bit of a beast for 4K ray tracing, even though the overall frame rate is a bit low. This is really the first card that makes ray tracing playable in this game at this resolution. However, there's still no significant gain to the acceleration provided by Ampere. The 3080 sees a 36% drop to performance when ray tracing is enabled, versus 39% on the 2080 Ti. This suggests the 3080 is about 8% better at accelerating ray tracing in this title. But you'll be more likely playing Control with DLSS enabled, given DLSS 2.0 provides near equivalent image quality to native 4K. Here, all of the Nvidia cards tested are actually faster with ray tracing and DLSS enabled, compared to running at a native resolution without ray tracing. So in a pure comparison of native versus RTX features, turning on RTX provides a similar frame rate provided you are using DLSS to compensate. However, in my opinion, that's far too simplistic of a comparison. As you can also use DLSS without ray tracing, the more accurate exploration is DLSS without ray tracing versus DLSS with ray tracing, because we don't really see why you'd run the game at a native resolution. Most Nvidia GPU owners will be choosing between the high frame rates on offer with DLSS or the image quality offered with DLSS plus ray tracing. DLSS is just a given. You turn that on first when you play the game, then tweak the other settings to hit the performance you're after. So when looking at the DLSS results, the 3080 is 40% faster than the 2080 Ti when both ray tracing and DLSS are enabled, and 85% faster than the 2080. The 3080 sees a 34% hit to frame rate when you enable ray tracing with DLSS already enabled, while the 2080 Ti sees a 37% hit. So this is quite similar to the RT on versus off numbers at a native resolution, and at least in Control you aren't getting an increased acceleration ability when you switch on DLSS. In fact, both cards are similar in terms of the performance uplift you can expect from DLSS. The RTX 3080 was 71% faster when enabling DLSS without ray tracing, and 75% with ray tracing. The RTX 2080 Ti was 73% faster without ray tracing, and 80% with ray tracing. This is using the highest quality DLSS option at this resolution. At 1440p, there's not too much more to say that wasn't covered at 4K. The performance hit due to enabling ray tracing is a little less severe at this resolution at around the 30% mark, and overall performance is quite impressive with the RTX 3080. The RTX 2080 was only a 1440p 60fps card with ray tracing and DLSS enabled, whereas the RTX 3080 is a true 1440p high refresh option. Next up is Wolfenstein Youngblood, and what we have here are two separate sets of data for the RTX 3080. The first set is with the game's current code, and the other, labelled Allow Async Present, is performance with an upcoming patch that is designed to better utilise Ampere's asynchronous compute capabilities, particularly for ray tracing. Without the improvements to asynchronous compute, the RTX 3080 offers a 37% improvement to performance over the RTX 2080 when both DLSS 2.0 and ray traced reflections are enabled. But that increases to a much larger 54% when allowing async present is enabled on the RTX 3080. We also see over twice the performance of the RTX 2080, taking respectable 4K 60fps performance right up into the realms of high refresh rate 4K. While increased asynchronous capabilities are nice, there is still that pesky performance drop between running the game just with DLSS enabled and with DLSS plus ray tracing. The RTX 2080 Ti saw a 36% drop to frame rate, the RTX 3080 without the new game patch saw a 32% drop, and with the new patch we saw a 29% drop. However, that does make the RTX 3080 24% better at accelerating both ray tracing and DLSS than the RTX 2080 Ti, which is a healthy gain. With that said, the gains aren't as significant at 1440p in this title, with the 2080 Ti and 3080 providing similar acceleration capabilities. This means that overall the 3080 is still a significant 41% faster than the 2080 Ti with ray tracing, DLSS 2.0 and Allow Async Present enabled, but we're not getting the 54% gain that we saw at 4K. Fortnite is one of the latest titles to include ray tracing support, and it actually features quite a number of settings, including shadows, reflections, ambient occlusion, and global illumination. This comes at a hefty price, especially at 4K. Even with DLSS 2.0 enabled, if you turn on all RTX effects with an RTX 3080 GPU, you're facing a reduction from 135 FPS down to just 42 FPS. The game is unplayable with ray tracing and no DLSS at this resolution, even with the 3080. If you decide to only use reflections on the maximum setting, with reflections being the most noticeable effect in the game, the performance hit is less savage, dropping down to just 70 FPS. Still, with the 3080, turning on reflections to maximum will halve your frame rate, while you'll see just a third of the frame rate with all effects enabled. This is quite similar with the RTX 2080 Ti, at least with just reflections enabled, which you can see in this chart as well. A drop from 104 FPS with DLSS 2.0 enabled to 51 FPS with Epic RT reflections is a huge hit. However, overall, the RTX 3080 is 37% faster than the 2080 Ti at ray tracing reflections in this title, so that's a solid result for this new generation, while the 3080 is also 80% ahead of the 2080. At 1440p, the difference between RT on and off is even more severe than it was at 4K. The RTX 3080 is good for 212 FPS with DLSS enabled and no ray tracing, but drops to below 100 FPS with Epic reflections and just 76 FPS with all ray tracing effects. For a fast-paced game, that's a big performance hit, and while the RTX 3080 is faster than other RTX GPUs in this title, in my opinion, the performance level with ray tracing just isn't there to warrant turning it on over playing at super high frame rates just with DLSS 2.0. We're going to wrap this one up with a look at titles that just include DLSS 2.0 so we can see how the RTX 3080 fares when ray tracing is not in the picture. In Death Stranding, the RTX 3080 receives a healthy performance boost from DLSS 2.0 at 4K, with 31% higher frame rates. Meanwhile, the 2080 Ti sees a 33% boost and the 2080 gets a 38% boost. We know that DLSS performance gains are better at lower frame rates based on our previous investigations, so this suggests to me that both Turing and Ampere have similar DLSS acceleration capabilities, and we've seen that from previous charts too. What this means in practice is that with DLSS enabled, the 3080 is 27% faster than the 2080 Ti in Death Stranding, while without DLSS, the 3080 is 29% faster. So a much of a muchness here, DLSS doesn't significantly affect those margins either way. You're still getting that class above performance with the 3080. Native 4K performance is similar to what the 2080 Ti can do at 4K with DLSS, which is impressive. At 1440p, we run into more limitations with what DLSS can do. With the 3080, there's just a 7% performance gain compared to 21% with the 2080 Ti. In the end, the 3080 ends up just 6% ahead of the 2080 Ti. Steve has flagged to me that there is a possible bug with Death Stranding and DLSS 2.0 with lower resolutions. At 1080p, performance is actually worse with DLSS enabled, but only with Ampere, so it's possible this will be patched or improved, but to keep everything consistent, I did still want to show 1440p in this game. And finally, we have F1 2020, which was recently updated to include DLSS 2.0 support. At 4K using the ultra high quality preset, the 3080 does benefit from DLSS in a similar way to Death Stranding, with a 20% performance gain. This allows it to be 34% faster than the 2080 Ti with DLSS enabled, although the acceleration gains are similar for DLSS between Turing and Ampere. So this is another example where the RTX 3080 is giving you gains from DLSS, but those gains aren't any better than with prior generation cards. Similar story at 1440p, both the RTX 2080 Ti and RTX 3080 deliver around a 9% performance gain when enabling DLSS. We're seeing very high frame rates here though, and like we've talked about a few times, DLSS sees diminishing returns the higher the frame rates are. Not that I think anyone will complain about getting 200 FPS at 1440p with this new Ampere GPU. Overall, there are two pretty different ways you can look at the ray tracing and DLSS performance of the RTX 3080. There's a lot of stuff to like about what this card is capable of, but also a few angles which are far from impressive. So let's start with the positive stuff. The RTX 3080 is clearly the fastest GPU on the market for ray tracing right now, and the performance on offer here brings proper ray tracing capabilities to a new tier of use cases. Nvidia have essentially achieved this by brute forcing the design. Relative to the RTX 2080, there's more SMs, way more CUDA cores, more memory bandwidth, and crucially, more ray tracing cores. This makes the RTX 3080 a much faster card than the RTX 2080 and the RTX 2080 Ti overall, and by extension, this means the card is also faster in games with ray tracing enabled. This allows for two major upgrades compared to the previous flagship GPU from Nvidia. The big one is at 4K. In a lot of titles, the RTX 2080 Ti was barely fast enough for 4K 30fps ray tracing, especially in games that didn't support DLSS 2.0. No PC gamer wants to play at 30fps, so realistically, the 2080 Ti wasn't fast enough for 4K ray tracing. That's different with the RTX 3080. Which often approaches 60 FPS and certainly delivers very playable performance in graphically gorgeous games like Control with DLSS and even Metro Exodus without DLSS. The RTX 3080 is also a much more capable ray tracing option at 1440p. The RTX 2080 Ti was mostly a 60 to 80ish FPS card at 1440p with ray tracing in the most graphically intensive games. The RTX 3080 pushes up more into the realms of high refresh rate 1440p with ray tracing, and if you're coming from the RTX 2080, which struggles at this resolution, the 3080 will be a night and day upgrade. The less impressive aspects to the RTX 3080's ray tracing more concern the acceleration provided by the 2nd gen RT cores and 3rd gen Tensor cores. There is still a very significant performance hit in a lot of instances when enabling ray tracing, with a 30% drop in frame rate a fairly typical result. So while you might get, say, 65 FPS with ray tracing enabled, generally that same game will run at over 100 FPS with ray tracing disabled. With Ampere, there's still that choice between the visual effects of ray tracing or performance. In some games like Control, ray tracing provides enough of a visual upgrade that you may want to accept the performance hit. In other games, the upgrade is not as significant, so taking a 40 to 50 FPS hit can be hard to swallow. That's no different from previous generations, it's just the 3080 is a faster GPU overall. The most disappointing thing to me is that the ray tracing acceleration the RTX 3080 provides isn't that much improved over the RTX 2080 Ti. In several games we tested, there's either no or less than a 10% speed up to ray tracing acceleration comparing these two GPUs. In other words, the gap between RTX on and RTX off is only 10% smaller with the RTX 3080, which is why we still see that huge performance drop with RT enabled. Even in a best case like Wolfenstein Youngblood at 4K with a specific patch to improve Ampere performance, the 3080 is only 25% better at ray tracing acceleration. We really needed to see a 50 or even 100% improvement to acceleration before the gap between RTX on and off feels like it's at an acceptable level with today's effects. Because Ampere is only a minor improvement over Turing for acceleration, there's still question marks over whether this card is sufficient for the next few years of ray tracing. Most of today's games use only one or two effects and use them pretty sparingly. If games start going all out on ray tracing effects, more like what we see with Fortnite, the gap between RTX on and off will grow substantially. More acceleration with more powerful RT cores will be required to keep up. Of course, this is all speculation about the future, so we'll have to see what happens with the next few years of games. As for DLSS 2.0, well, again, there's really not much of a difference between Turing and AMP in the way DLSS 2.0 works and how much of a performance gain it delivers. So the margin between a 2080 Ti and 3080 with DLSS 2.0 enabled is similar to the margin between the cards with it disabled. That's not necessarily a bad thing, given DLSS 2.0 still provides you with a sizable performance uplift at the same visual quality anyway, but it doesn't seem to harness 3rd gen tensor cores to deliver even more performance than previous cards. While it is disappointing that many of the gains seen with RTX effects are from brute forcing rather than acceleration improvements, the entire discussion around ray tracing is very different with the 30 series launch versus 20 series. Previously, we slayed Nvidia for overpromising and under-delivering with ray tracing and DLSS, the two major features that they used to sell 20 series cards. Nvidia was hoping the poor value of the 2080 versus the 1080 Ti would be overshadowed by how amazing ray tracing is and how it was a must-buy feature. The reality ended up being that in the 2 years since launch, there were very few games released with ray tracing support and even fewer with ray tracing at launch, and Nvidia even had to totally overhaul DLSS to make it actually usable. With few other benefits to the 20 series, it became a very messy launch and a bit of a bust. With the 30 series and the RTX 3080, we're in a totally different position. The card is offering much better value than prospects from the previous generation thanks to serious gains to general game performance and lower prices. This makes ray tracing more of a bonus feature, the way it should have been with the 20 series. It's much easier to overlook the small selection of games with ray tracing when in all the other games you were getting 20 to 30% more performance than a 2080 Ti for $500 less. So I think from here, we'll see pretty smooth sailing for ray tracing. The angst around poor value cards won't be there. We'll see more games come in with better ray tracing effects, and we'll also see competition in ray tracing from AMD and eventually Intel. Unfortunately, 20 series buyers have been a bit of a sacrificial lamb on this one, paying a huge premium to early adopt on overpromised technology, but a lot of reviewers did, I guess, warn that that would happen, and certainly that has been corrected somewhat with this 30 series. Anyway, that's it for our investigation into ray tracing and DLSS performance with the RTX 3080. We'll have more content coming up on the 3080, more follow-up investigations from Steve, so yeah, subscribe to the channel, make sure you don't miss those. You can also support us directly if you're interested through Patreon. Links are in the description below. You'll gain access to monthly live streams. We've got our Discord chat as well. Been some fun discussion in there over this 3080 launch, so it's well worth signing up for that. And yeah, that's it. I'll catch you in the next one.